Welcome to Webhooks in Nuxt 3. This video is part of a series where we build a full stack Nuxt application. Let's recap where we are in the series. In the first video, we set up the basis for our application, including an authentication system and dark mode. In the second video, we learn how to create subscriptions in Stripe, and we'll take that one step further in this video by processing the webhooks Stripe sends us whenever a subscription is created or updated. For those of you unfamiliar with webhooks, I'll quickly explain what they are. So when an event happens in Stripe, for example, an invoice was paid, we'll just say event here. So it could be any event as long as Stripe has a setup for it, or even outside of Stripe. If you're watching this video just to understand webhooks in general, this holds true for webhooks in general. So whatever service provider is sending a webhook, they'll do it based on some sort of event that happens on their server. For Stripe, a great example is an invoice was paid. When that invoice is paid, they're going to send an HTTP post request to our server, and we will be listening for that. And so, for example, say you sell socks, and you have a website called ilovesocks.com. Then you would set up an endpoint called, for example, API, webhooks, and that's it. So ilovesocks.com/API/webhooks. Then Stripe, whenever an event happens, they're going to send a post request to this endpoint, which your server will be listening for. Then you can process that with whatever business logic you need. And what this does is it frees us from having to poll Stripe. So before webhooks, what people used to do is they used to constantly make GET requests in this direction. So you waste a lot of resources constantly checking, did anything change? Did anything change? Did anything change? Kind of like when children ask, are we there yet? So some smart people figured out, hey, why don't we just wait for a response or wait for a request from the server? The provider knows when something changes and we don't know that. And that's the information that we want. So since they know it, instead of us constantly having to ask, why don't we just listen? So that is the basics of webhooks. And now that we know that, let's check how we can listen for those webhooks on a local dev environment. So the issue is locally, we don't have an internet accessible port from which we can listen for these webhooks. So we need to use port forwarding. And what port forwarding does is Stripe sends the request to, for example, ngrok and then a bunch of gibberish and then /API/webhooks. And we tell Stripe this, in which I'll show you how to put that in the dashboard. Then what ngrok does is it sends the requests to our local machine on localhost and then whatever port we specify. And we'll just say localhost 3000. That's the standard port for Stripe or for Nuxt. ngrok is very simple to set up and very easy. So if we go, you can just go to ngrok.com, which this isn't sponsored. I just like the tool. And then you can just log in. I log in with GitHub. And it's very easy to set up on your local machine. There's only 3 steps, and make sure you add your auth token. And then on the command line, you'll be able to just do ngrok HTTP, and then you're going to tell it where you want to send all the requests. And so for development purposes, we'll use localhost 3000. Then we have this internet accessible endpoint, which is pointing to our local host. So we'll take this and we'll add this to the Stripe dashboard so that Stripe can start sending webhooks to this endpoint. So in the Stripe dashboard, if you go over to developers up here on the right, then webhooks on the left, we can add an endpoint. So add the URL from ngrok, then we'll do /API Stripe webhooks, and that will be our endpoint here. And then we'll just say dev here, and then we're going to need to listen for certain events. You could listen for everything, but then your server would be just completely bombarded with a bunch of unnecessary webhooks. So we're going to do the minimum amount just to get our service up and running. So if you go to customer.subscriptions, we'll see create it, delete it, and update it. Those will be the minimum that we need to listen for. There are other webhooks that you could listen for. For example, if an invoice needs to be, so invoice, payment requires action. In Europe, there's that strong customer authentication system that is a couple years old. And from time to time, your customer may be required to log in and actually verify that they want to have a certain transaction take place. So you could listen for that as well. If you'd like. But the 3 for the subscriptions are what are most relevant for the app that we're building right now. And you'll see they give you an example Express app, but we're using Nuxt. We will just steal this switch statement, and then we're going to go ahead and add that endpoint. Now, if an event were to happen, so they would start sending webhooks to this event if one of these 3 events happen. So let's actually cause an event to happen. So just like the last tutorial, if you want to code along, you want to check out section 3, which ends where this tutorial begins. And if you just want the end result, then check out section 4. In the server API Stripe directory, we would like to create a new endpoint, which is webhooks.post.ts. And here, the first thing we'll do is import Stripe so we can get those handy types that they have. And then we'll define our event handler, and we'll get the body, and we will type it to a Stripe event because that's what we'll be receiving. And then we will define our subscription. And now we can start handling those events. We'll use a switch statement here. And then for each event, we will create a case. And then we'll also have a default for when we do not handle that sort of event. And then we'll just return to Stripe that we have handled that event, which will be a 200 automatically. First, let's actually check to see that this is working. So let's go ahead and start up the application running yarn dev. We'll be on 3000. So let's actually create a subscription so that we can cause an event to actually happen. Let's go with Jack here, sign in. Okay, so premium membership, subscribe. I'll fill this out. And if we check the Stripe dashboard, we can see that these have already sent, and we can see that we received a 200 response from our server. So which means that we do have an actual working connection. And now we can get started on handling these events and implementing our business logic. Before we get started handling these subscription webhooks, I want to add a couple fields to the schema here. The start date of the subscription, so we can show the user when they start it. And then here, the last event date. And the reason I want to show this, to add this, is because in Stripe, they don't guarantee the order of events. Essentially, the events will be in order, but you might not receive these webhooks in order. So we'll use this created, and this tells us when this actual event was created, and those will be sequential. And we can make sure that we're always updating it with the latest version. So if they do come out of order, we would have, let's say we get updated first, we'll still create the subscription and the status may be active, as in here. And then say we get this webhook, which is created, which would normally come first, but in this case, we got it out of order and the status here is incomplete. We wouldn't want to overwrite this newer status of active with the old status of incomplete. So that's the reason for adding this last event date. You can call it whatever you want. I'm calling it that. And then we want to make sure we do our migration. And you may need to migrate fresh, or I think there's a migrate reset is what it's called. You might need to do that and lose your data if you've already created subscriptions, or you can just delete those manually and then run the migration. Either way will work. Now let's get started on actually handling the webhooks. All right, to handle the subscription created event, we will do that actually in the Stripe service. And then we will grab the subscription from the object, and then we will handle a subscription change. In that Stripe service, we will create a function called handle subscription change, and we will accept that subscription and that last event date as a number that we discussed a second ago. And here we will use the Stripe customer ID. We'll grab that from the subscription, and then we'll grab the user from the database with that Stripe subscription in this get user by Stripe customer ID function, where we get the user, we find the first user with this Stripe customer ID. Then we'll just grab the ID from that so that we can have the relationship between the subscription and the user. And then we'll grab all of this data from the subscription along with that price ID, the start date, and we've already gotten that event date from the event that we passed in. And we'll type all that using a subscription type, which we have now added these two fields, the start date and last event date, to the type. Once we have all of that, we can pass that to the user repository for it to create, or let's actually rename this, create or update subscription. So then we will, inside of the user repository, create or update subscription. We'll actually leave that called the same thing there. So we'll go into the user repository, and then here at the bottom, we'll call it create or update subscription. And we'll simply see if there is already a Stripe subscription here by this Stripe ID. So this Stripe ID is the Stripe subscription ID. You could be more explicit and name it Stripe subscription ID if you'd like. And then if it's not already in the database, we'll create it. And if it is, we will only update these fields here because we don't need to update the user. That's going to be the same. We don't need to update the Stripe ID. That will be the same. And the other ones can vary, so we will update them. So now we can see what happens when we actually create a subscription. And because I nuked my database, I'm going to have to create a user, which I will do. So here we'll create the user. Still need that dashboard. Go to premium membership and we will subscribe. I'll fill this out. All right, and if we check the Stripe dashboard, we'll see we have handled these two requests. And if we check the ID of the subscription, it ends in U56R7. We can check in Stripe, or sorry, in Prisma, and we have U56R7. So we are creating the subscription. Now we can focus on updating that subscription. If we go back to the webhooks, we can essentially do the same thing as we're doing here. But now that I think about it, instead of just copying, well, we'll just copy it for now and then we'll clean it up afterwards. So we can just basically copy this for the delete it and copy this for update it, because it's always going to be the same object and we always want to do the exact same thing with it. And we'll clean this up in a minute. So now I should be able to go to Stripe and resend that updated webhook, and then this should go to active because we see here updated, the status is active. The old status, previous status is incomplete, and the new status is active. So let's send that. You don't always have to recreate a new subscription. You can always resend when you're in test mode in Stripe. So without any problems, we get it as active. So that's great. And now let's see what happens if we resend this. So this will allude what I alluded to earlier. Now, if I send created again, we'll see that this status, it updates back to incompleted. And the reason for that is we're not actually checking if it's the newest status. So we have it saved here now, last active or last event date, but we're not actually checking it. So let's go ahead and do that. In the handle Stripe change or handle subscription change, we want to add a check here, and that check will get the subscription by ID. And that's just find first by the Stripe ID. And if that exists, we're going to get that date. And if the date in the database is greater than the event date here, the new event, let's say the event that we're receiving, then we will just return true and we'll skip all of this updating. If not, it can update if it's a newer status. So now when we update to the new active, it's going to allow us to change. So now it's active. But if we try to put an old status on there, because this is newer than this, it will not update and it will stay the same. So that is how we can avoid this inconsistent status with Stripe. And now we could do a little bit of cleanup here in the webhooks, because these are all the same thing. So I don't like that duplication. We really don't even need a switch statement, but we're going to leave it there for now because perhaps you want to catch other types of webhooks that I haven't shown here, and I'll just leave it just in case of that. So what we want to do is we want to see, is this a Stripe subscription event? And that will be, we'll just say starts with, so they all start with the same thing, which is customer subscription. We'll just copy that here. If it is that, then we'll go if that is true, then we'll set this value equal to subscription event. And then here we can just check for that. And all of those fall away. So you don't really need a switch statement there, but it's not hurting anything, so we'll leave it as it is. A switch statement with literally one. Okay, I just feel too stupid about that. We'll just go like this. If, let's see. If that is true, then we'll just handle that. And then we'll return early because it's the only event we're checking. I just can't leave that switch statement there in good conscience. And then otherwise, we'll just console log. We'll still say we handled it. We'll just console log. Now, well, actually, it would be better to know or could not handle this event. No functionality set. Something like that. All right, now let's try that. We can try to create another event and send that. So for now, we'll just log it and we'll send back a 400 to Stripe. So let's actually see if that works. And we'll do that by adding, update the details, and then we'll add another type of event. So invoice payment required or action required. That is already a reasonable event. And how can we cause this event to happen? So if you go to Stripe /testing, you can see all of the different kinds of cards that they have for testing. And what we want is a card that is always going to require, so different scenarios. Let's see, disputes, fraud, decline, 3D secure authentication. That's good. This card requires authentication for every payment. Let's see. This one is insufficient funds. That should work. Let's create a new subscription. So will it let me add a different payment method? I want to change the payment method. We'll use this one. Now I'll subscribe. We'll see what happens. We'll see if it gives us this webhook. So it's been declined. Let's see if it sends a webhook. Cool. Payment requires action. That's exactly what I wanted. And we see our 400 because we're not actually handling this webhook. So could not handle invoice payment action required. No functionality set. You could change this to whatever you want. But just the point is, if you're not going to handle it, then you should have some sort of catch-all that says, hey, I'm not handling this. And then at least you'll get some feedback in the Stripe dashboard. And it will actually retry this as well. So in 1 hour, it's going to retry it. And that's important to know. I think you get the general gist of how to handle webhooks. You could go and read through the Stripe documentation to see every little edge case that you could possibly need. The documentation is very good, but for the purposes of understanding how webhooks work, I think we got it. So I will see you in the next one.